as we framed it, but I'm going to pass it over to Barrie to transition us into not talking about the process, but just engaging in it. Barrie.
Thanks so much, Bridget. Justin, actually, this issue came out of a conversation that Justin and I were having. And so I asked him to present it from his perspective in a few sentences, and then we'll take a minute to just think about any questions that come up. And then type your questions in the chat and I'll call on you to voice them out loud. So go ahead, Justin.
Okay. We are living in a time that seems unending with a problem that seems unending, and yet the human experience and human cost incurred, both large and small, is very, very real. And so the question of how to manage that process individually, societally, relationally, became very real and also very unanswered. And so the wicked issue, the question is, how might I grieve and process the loss of COVID patients who die when the need to move on to the next patient is unrelenting?
So as people feel moved to put their questions in the chat, I'll go ahead and call on them. And Justin, feel no pressure at all. You just sit back and if you have questions, you can add them, but you just take it in. You don't need to answer anything. Stuart.
How have you moved on in the past when you have lost a patient? What have you done before that has helped you to move on?
Stacy.
How are grief and celebration the same and different?
Bridget.
I'm thinking a little bit like Stuart, but maybe from a slightly broader lens. When in history has a similar overwhelm happened in the healthcare system, or maybe even in other caregiving spaces?
Trevini.
Who is or isn't a COVID patient?
Help you manage grief from one patient with the hope with the next patient.
Emma.
I come at this with a bit of a bias because I think grief is love for someone who's died. How does it shift things for you if you swap the word grieve for love?
Bridget.
Building on that question from Emma, I'm wondering what would happen if love were at the center of how your whole workflow was designed.
Melissa.
So how do we cope or deal with the loss of a family member and patients while trying to celebrate life of the people around us?
Stacy.
Hypo. Who do I feel safe grieving with?
What can we do even better when we're open about grieving?
Bridget.
What's not being said that needs to be said? And like by whom? Which voices are not voicing what they need to?
I have a question. What exchanges, if you think of grief or love or whatever energy is exchanged between doctors and patients. What exchanges are valued and by who? Stuart.
What can we do to preserve and strengthen our humanity and empathy as we grieve? And as we move on, how do we hold on to empathy and humanity and still move on with it? Use it to grieve and have empathy with grief, and at the same time use it to move on.
Emma.
If you could hear words of support from those that you've cared for who have died, what might they say to you? What might they want?
Bridget.
I've been thinking since Melissa's question about what we've learned from COVID about the relationship between the personal and the professional.
Stacy.
Not sure how to frame this, but I'm thinking, how is grieving, rather than a thing we do, a thing we live into?
Probably have time for a couple more. But we can keep the questions coming as we move into discussion.
How do we learn to balance our personal from professional, I guess, grieving? I think Bridget kind of said this, but how to manage that? That's a question.
Miriam.
Not sure if how it's written here, it's well understood. The meaning is how grief is part of being a good healthcare professional. It's part of the excellence that you're providing to your patients.
Sorry, I lost track a little bit of these, but Emma.
Yes, I've got two actually, because I'm halfway through writing another one.
Mm-hmm.
If you could put just the tiniest bit of space around the grief you feel, what would you put? What would be in that space? And if I can do my second one.
Sure.
If 2020, 2021 is humankind's opportunity to learn how to live better and what matters. ... I haven't finished my thought. Let me reflect on that bit a bit more.
Bridget.
What would you want your next patient to know about your last patient?
Miriam. Triveni.
How do we handle guilt in grieving?
Emma, do you want to finish your thought?
It went somewhere different than I was thinking. So if 2020, 21 is our opportunity to learn how to live better and what matters in life and how to live, what does grief teach us? What must we learn? Yeah, it's even better.
I think we're gonna keep the questions coming, but we can turn it over to Justin if you feel comfortable about if you have any new insights into the question or you saw any patterns and responses, and we can then just open it up.
These are lovely questions. The primary pattern that is new in the best way in which the old pattern that I had for thinking about this question, the way in which that old pattern is now broken, is that I was using too few words. Adding words like excellence, love, opportunity, responsibility around grief helps displace the fairly routine generic cultural association that exists, at least in my field and in my country, with grief as a slightly shameful and very personal act and emotion. And I'm smiling because these questions make me see how silly that is. And so this was thank you. Great questions.